Hey guys, my name is Cassidy and you're watching That Spooky Lifestyle, where we bring the ooky, the spooky, the creepy, and the crawly into our everyday lives. Today we're going to be talking about the infamous Jack the Ripper. So needless to say, this video is going to be a bit more on the gruesome side, so this is your warning. Now I know this video is a bit more on the true crime side than we normally do, but since I've been researching topics for my Halloween videos, I've been in kind of an ooky spooky mood, so here we are. Before we get started, I did want to mention if you're looking for more spooky content, definitely check out 401 Files here on YouTube. They do a lot of investigation type videos, kind of vlogs, sit down chit chats about UFOs and Bigfoot, so let's check it out.
Hey guys, thank you for joining me back here again at the 401 Files HQ. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all here again.
If you've had an experience or something creepy happen to you in your life, we want to hear about it.
I'm sure the alien stuff, if they have it, is somewhere where nobody's gonna know where it is.
Finally found my way back to camp. Thank God.
I'll leave their social media linked below, but don't go yet. I'll remind you again at the end of the video. I've also included a poll here, so please let me know what topic you want me to do for my next Get Ready With Me video. It's between fairies, hellhounds, and shadow people. With all of that out of the way, if you're ready to get started, let's talk about the mysterious murderer that stalked the streets of London. Jack the Ripper is easily one of the most notorious killers that has ever and will ever exist. For the first time, murders were making newspaper headlines. Rumors of Jack the Ripper weren't just flooding the streets of London, they were really flooding the world. The story of Jack the Ripper has been told over and over again throughout the years, really immortalizing him as this sort of boogeyman character. He really symbolizes that, what's lurking in the shadows, that flash of movement that you catch out of the corner of your eye. He's really that omnipresence evil that's always lurking but you can never quite catch. Today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at 3 interesting characters that were suspected of being Jack the Ripper. We're going to take a look at the Vengeful Lover, the Medicine Man, and the Maniac. But we all know we can't talk about the suspects without laying some groundwork down first. So our story starts in London, 1888. The specific area we'll be looking at is the East End of London, known as the Whitechapel district, and this is the poor area of London, and when I say poor, I mean poor. In this area there was a lot of overcrowding. It said that up to 9-10 people would sleep in one room, and the hotels that you could rent there, or I don't know what they call them back then. But basically what they did is they tie a rope on each end of the room, and it was so that people could sleep standing up so that they could cram more people into the same room. Could you imagine? It was also just a really gross place in general. There was straw and horse shit and just sewage throughout the area, just if you're walking to go get, your vegetables, there would just be hay, and it would smell like crap all the time. It was just a really poor, unsanitary, nasty area of town. So not shockingly, in this area, it did have a very high death rate, especially for children. During this time, it wasn't uncommon for kids to basically die by the age of 5. It was just kind of, that's what happened. During this time, it was also very hard for women to find work, and if they did find work, it essentially didn't pay well enough for them to sleep and eat. Because of this, most women who lived in the area did have to resort to prostitution simply because it paid better. It said that up to 5,000 prostitutes lived in this area, and 1 in every 16th house was a brothel. Now there are 5 confirmed Jack the Ripper killings. These are called the 5 canonical victims, but there are people who believe that his victim count could be up to at least 11. I say the 5 canonical victims because these are the victims that the majority of people investigating the cases believed were actually killed by Jack the Ripper. The other ones, there wasn't enough evidence to prove it, and back then they didn't have the same technology or even kept reporting like they do now. Even when you look at some of the suspects we're going to talk about, the police only wrote down the last name of the suspect, not the first name, so so then people aren't even totally sure if like that's the person they're talking about. It was a very different time then. So essentially these 5 canonical victims are the ones history has attributed to Jack the Ripper. The canonical 5 were all women, they were all prostitutes, they all lived in the Whitechapel area, and interestingly enough, they all used to be married, some of them had families, but they eventually got separated from their husbands either by death or divorce, and then luck turned on them and they ended up being prostitutes in the Whitechapel district. Keep in mind, a lot of the facts surrounding the Jack the Ripper case are actually just rumors or theories that have been sensationalized by the media. Even the title Jack the Ripper was coined from a letter that may have been written by someone just trying to pose as the killer. So these are just things I want you to keep in mind as we talk about the facts in this case. August 31st, 1888, Marianne Nichols was found dead. The body of Marianne Nichols, or Polly Nichols, was found slumped over on the ground by Charles Cross and Robert Paul. Charles was the first on the scene, and then Robert kind of came up as Charles was looking at kind of the body, and at first he didn't really know what it was. He thought it was just like a bundle of clothes on the ground, but then upon further inspection he realized it was a person kind of like slumped over. Because you know, back in those days women had to wear like those big kind of poofy Victorian dresses, and so it would be a lot of fabric. We're not actually going to be talking too much about Charles Cross in this video, but while I was researching it, I came across this really interesting video that basically presented the case that Charles Cross is Jack the Ripper, because like when Charles Cross was investigated, he like gave the police an address that wasn't his own, and he just kind of did some shady dealings in his life, and he was just like an interesting character. And again, there's not really enough evidence to fully find out if Charles Cross was Jack the Ripper, but it is definitely an interesting video, and if I can find it again, I will link it in the description box below. So Mary's neck was slashed so savagely that she was almost decapitated. And she also had a bunch of really deep stab wounds to her abdomen, as well as her sexual organs were mutilated, so there's that. I will say that throughout these crimes, I have come across quite a few reports that they do believe that the Jack the Ripper killings were sexually motivated. So when authorities like asked around, apparently Marianne Nichols had been seen alive just an hour before Charles and Robert found her, and the doctor on the scene reported that she had only been dead for a half hour when Charles and Robert came across her. So the Whitechapel area itself is actually quite busy because, like I said, it is the poor area of town. So it's not shocking that her body was found so quickly after she had been murdered, but what is odd to think about is that a murderer would choose such a busy area to commit a murder, right? And I mean, there's a number of theories for that. Some people think he's reckless, some people think he knows the area very well, so just felt comfortable doing it there. You know, maybe he did it because, you know, he thought that no one would care about these prostitutes, so no one would really look into it that much. There's theories. So obviously, due to the very brutal nature of this murder, the newspapers jumped on it like that. And then a little over a week later, the second body was found. September 8th, 1888, Annie Chapman was found dead. Her body was found laying on the ground near the doorway to a backyard. This murder was linked to the previous one because they both had very similar wounds. Annie Chapman also had a huge gash in her neck and very violent stab wounds to her abdomen. The doctor reviewing this body also said that it would have been around the same size of knife that would have been used on both women. So there is a theory out there that these wounds were inflicted by someone with anatomical knowledge, so someone who knows the body, knows where the organs are, all of that. Especially since in this case with Annie, her uterus was removed and her intestines were actually pulled out and kind of like draped over her shoulder like as she was laying down, which is just a visual I'm sure you guys didn't need. Even for like today's standards and what the serial killers we've seen since Jack the Ripper, it's still a really gruesome, bloody case in my personal opinion. It's still like up there with one of the most disturbing. September 27th, 1888, Dear Boss. So a letter that people refer to as Dear Boss shows up at the Central News Agency, and during this time there were a lot of people like hoaxing the media and hoaxing the police, pretending to be Jack the Ripper or just kind of doing pranks about it. What this felt like to me when I was looking into it is people of higher class weren't really taking this seriously because, you know, these murders were happening in a totally different, you know, world than what they were used to. Like the Whitechapel district was so poor and so like bad conditions that, you know, people of higher class, I don't think they really related to it. And because it was the first time something like this was happening, it was almost like how you watch a horror movie or something where you're not quite personalizing it. You're like, you can see the blood and the gore and like hear about all this crazy stuff, but for some reason it doesn't make that kind of emotional, scary connection. It's just like a thrill. That seems to me, looking into it, what higher class people in this time were doing, because a lot of them were doing like pranks on it or hoaxes or like trying to throw people off, and it was just like, that's a bit fucked up. It's crazy because people still do shit like that today, which is just like, what? So this is the letter that I was talking about that had the Jack the Ripper signature on it for the first time, and this is what coined the name for the media, the newspapers, and the world, and how we know him today. At this time, when they received the letter, they did believe it was a hoax. They did not take it seriously at all, but they do look into it a little bit closer a little bit later. So I'm gonna read it to you guys now. Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write in, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope, haha. The next job I do shall clip the lady's ear off and send it to the police officers, just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit of more work, and then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get it to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Haha. I don't know. To me, it almost sounds like someone trying to sound scarier than they are. Almost like a teenager is writing it, you know what I mean? But it was a different time then, so maybe that's just how they talked. But it just, to me, it didn't come off as that like chilling feeling. It was just kind of like, what's going on here? What do you guys think? Do you think it was from Jack the Ripper? September 30th, 1888, the double event. I'm not gonna pronounce this right. So Louis Diemschutz was driving home in kind of like a horse and buggy when the horse kind of veered to the right, and again he looked down and he saw this like bundle on the ground, and these guys keep thinking these are packages and they're not packages, they're women. So obviously at first he's like, what the hell is that? So he gets off his horse and carriage and takes a closer look, and it is in fact another body. This body turned out to be the victim Elizabeth Stride. The wounds on Elizabeth Stride were actually quite minimal compared to the other victims. It looks like her neck was just starting to get cut. This leads to two different theories. Some people say that that means it wasn't Jack the Ripper at all. This was just like a different murder that occurred. And other people believe that this is Jack the Ripper getting interrupted in mid-kill. Unfortunately, Elizabeth wasn't the only victim this night. Only 40 minutes after finding Elizabeth's body, they found a second body. Catherine Eddowes' body was found by a man named Alfred, and she was found actually walking distance from the first murder scene where Elizabeth had died, which is why people think that basically Jack the Ripper got interrupted when he was attacking Elizabeth, and so as he was walking away, stumbled across Catherine and then decided to attack Catherine instead and kind of finish off his work for the night. So that is one of the main reasons too, is that people think this is a Jack the Ripper killing, because it happened so soon and like in such close proximity to this one that it's like that coincidence is a bit too much to ignore. And Catherine did have the typical Jack the Ripper wounds, so this definitely linked Catherine to the previous murders. Something to note about this murder is after killing Catherine Eddowes, to get away, Jack the Ripper actually had to kind of double back and go towards his first murder of Elizabeth Stride. People say this is quite interesting because he knew that there would be kind of police theories starting to come about and people looking for suspects. This also backs up people's theories that he lived somewhere in the area, so he kind of had to double back to get to wherever the hell he was going. They found this out because they found a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron kind of down one of these alleyways. So again, no conclusive evidence from this, but interesting to note for sure. So the next Jack the Ripper correspondence actually shows itself in the form of a postcard. Most people know this by the name the Saucy Jack postcard. And this postcard was received October 1st. I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jack's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off, had not time to get ears off for police. Thanks for keeping the letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper. So this postcard actually is what like triggered the police to look into this postcard and the previous letter a bit more, because the postcard actually mentions the double event, like the double murder, and this postcard was received only 2 days after the murder and they hadn't been made public yet. So there is a pretty strong theory that people think these letters did come from Jack the Ripper, but again, can't know for sure. Another thing to note is a chunk of Catherine's ear was missing, so it did kind of go with the whole ear thing that he mentioned, which is eerie. I did not mean that pun. Oh, girl. October 6th, 1888. The supernatural element. Quoting an article from the East London Advertiser, if anything were to heighten the horrors of these tragedies, it was the introduction of a supernatural element. The article then went in to explain the supernatural phenomenon experienced by a woman named Mary Malcolm. It was 1:20 a.m. on September 30th, and Mary Malcolm awoke feeling a pressure on her breast, and she heard 3 kissing sounds in the air around her. This gave her the impression that something really awful happened to her sister Elizabeth Watts. So this article kind of spun the angle that the pressure on her breast was where the killer would have to kind of lay his hand on his victim to help steady himself to slit the throat. Nowadays we would call that a reach. That's a bit of a reach. So as Mary describes her sister Elizabeth Watts, Elizabeth seemed to have a pretty rough life going for her. Mary would state that Elizabeth had been accused of adultery, she had an illegitimate child, and kind of hinted at the fact that Elizabeth may have been a prostitute. The police didn't actually take Mary's testimony seriously because during this time there was a lot of like spiritualists and mediums sending in letters, you know, being like, this is, I felt this, I saw this is who it is. Like, they just had so many that they couldn't go through them all. Like, how would you even start with that, you know? And there's no physical evidence, it's just intuitive spiritual suggestions, do you know what I mean? So like, they just couldn't, honestly. And especially since they were getting so many, to hear another one, it would just be like, okay Mary, whatever. Okay Mary. In this specific instance, it's actually really good that they didn't listen to Mary, because during court, when Mary was, they called it the coroner's court. During this coroner's court, basically people were coming in saying, like witnesses were saying anything they could about what they saw, what they heard the nights of the murders, shit like that. And Mary's sister Elizabeth straight up shows up at this coroner's court and is like, I'm not dead. I'm also not like accused of adultery, I don't have an illegitimate child, and I'm not a prostitute. So you, Mary. Like, she was straight up like, stop telling lies about me. Isn't that crazy? Like, damn. To be a police officer and have to deal with all this, especially back then when you didn't have like the evidence that you could rely on now and the technology. October 8th, 1888. A spiritual clue. Like I said, Mary was not the only one to get an intuitive feeling from these murders. There were mediums and spiritualists all over the world looking into it, trying to get more information. So a newspaper called The Star reported that a medium in Boston held a seance October 7th and reportedly found the identity of Jack the Ripper. When you hear that, it sounds pretty cut and dry. Like, okay, where does he live? Where's he at? What's his name? I mean, media, right? They're always exaggerating. They didn't find the identity, they found what he looked like. They got the general picture description of what he looked like. The medium described Jack the Ripper as being a farmer, but dressing like a Navy man, like someone in the military, like well-dressed, medals, you know, the whole shebang. He had a strap around his waist and peculiar pockets. He also had a very thick and heavy mustache, very dark. They also said that he had cuts and gashes behind his ears as well as on other parts of his body, and stated that he would be caught in the act of another murder. And then it gets even crazier. Other spiritualists and intuitives were actually asking the police for locks of hair and like snips of clothing from the victims of like the night they were murdered, so that they could use those materials to like call upon the dead, talk to the dead, get some answers. So this brings us to October 15th, where another Jack the Ripper letter was sent. However, this one didn't get sent to the newspaper or the police. It actually got sent to a gentleman who was part of this club that was trying to help catch Jack the Ripper, but they weren't like actual police or investigators. They were just kind of like, I don't know, like a self-starting, you know what I mean? Just like, what is it called? Like a good citizen, good Samaritan kind of thing going on. It was sent to him. So this letter from Jack the Ripper was sent to this guy, and it was in a box with a kidney. But I'm not going to actually be talking about this letter because it turned out to be a hoax from a medical student. Like I said, kind of circling back to the upper class weren't taking it as like seriously as they should. Like, that's not a funny joke, man. Like, good one. People are really intrigued by this letter though because it's signed from hell. Today that sounds very like cheesy and like, oh, good one. But back then it was like hot shit back then. It was like, that is a crazy way to sign that. Wow. Like, oh my god, because this is the work of the devil kind of thing, you know, like it really, if you want to actually look into that letter, you can just type into Google "from hell Jack the Ripper letter" and it will show up. But to me, I was just like, it's a hoax. I'm not even. November 8th, 1888, Mary Kelly, the final victim. So the last victim was actually the most brutal, gruesome, disgusting, horrific crime out of them all. Like, it was really just the climax to the Jack the Ripper murders. So Mary Kelly was found in her own bed, basically completely disemboweled and almost completely skinned down. Someone who was actually at the scene of the crime and saw this with their own eyes said that it looked more like the work of the devil than of a man. The Jack the Ripper case had over 200 suspects, and it was officially closed 4 years after the murders happened. Basically, at this point, they realized that they didn't have enough evidence from the previous murders to catch anyone. Like, the case basically went cold. There was no new murders happening, which is good, but again, it also means no new evidence, and what they found wasn't conclusive enough for anyone. Since the media played such a huge role in these murders and sensationalized it so much, there was actually a public outcry when Jack the Ripper got away, especially since his murders were so gruesome and like everyone was talking about it, and then to have there just be no consequences, no repercussions, no villain. People felt like there was just no justice. And when you think about it, it's also just scary in general, like to have someone that dangerous just go free or just disappear. We're not really sure what happened, where he went. It would just be scary in general. There was actually such an outcry at the time that the police commissioner and home secretary actually resigned because they just couldn't. Honestly, I'm sure it weighed heavy on their conscience, and then with the media and the public, and I'm pretty sure they did not take it very lightly. Like, I'm sure they felt awful and wanted to catch the guy. No one wants to let someone like that just roam the streets free. So finally, that brings us to the question, who did it? Let's dig into a bit of post-mortem of our own on the situation and the crimes. Looking at all 5 of the canonical victims, all these murders happened within a 1-mile radius of each other. So I'm not sure if you guys know, but there is a thing called geoprofiling. This is a criminal investigation method that looks at the locations of all the murderers and tries to pinpoint a central location of where the murderer could reside. Maybe it's their home, maybe it's their area of work, some area that would tie kind of all the murder locations together. Since all of the victims were killed in Whitechapel, a lot of people either believed that the killer lived in Whitechapel. I would say that that is the most popular theory, or that he was a very frequent visitor, because I think since it is such a busy area and he was killing in such a busy area, he would need to know the ins and outs of all the alleyways to make sure he had a quick getaway in case he was interrupted. Looking a bit at the psychology of the murders, they were very show-offy. It was very much like gruesome, horrific. I want there to be public outcry. I know that at some point some innocent person is going to just stumble on the person I just killed, and this is how they're going to find them, and this is like the story I am telling. The gruesome aspects of these murders actually remind me of the serial killer William MacDonald. William MacDonald was responsible for killing 5 people in Australia between 1961 and 1962. He was named the Mutilator because he violently stabbed and punched his victims and then cut their genitals off, which is very similar to how Jack the Ripper treated his victims. He mutilated them, it was very violent, and he mutilated their sexual organs. There is a lot of similarities between these two cases. It's just that like extremely violent way of attacking someone and then knowing someone else is going to find them and see them like that. There have also been many serial killers throughout the years that have a very deep, serious hatred for women, and looking at their background, it usually stems from a mother figure or maternal figure that didn't treat them right, they didn't have a great relationship with. There's usually a connection there. Now we're gonna get into the suspects. Obviously, we do not have time to talk about all 200 different suspects in the Jack the Ripper case, especially since a lot of them were like, again, just sensationalized by the media. Like there was this one guy that was a prince and they were all like, oh, what if it was him? It could totally make sense it was him. And it was just, again, it was like, that's a bit of a reach. It's a reach. Literally any basically white man during that period that had a fucking mustache was a suspect. So today I'm going to be talking about the top 3 suspects that I found personally most interesting. I would say that these guys do come up on a lot of people's lists of being their top 5 or top 10 suspects of being Jack the Ripper. Like these guys are talked about quite a bit. So I think I've organized these from basically the least likely to the most likely is how we're going to talk about them. The first person we're going to talk about is the Medicine Man, and his name is Francis Tumblety. Francis Tumblety was basically a self-proclaimed profound physician, but a lot of people just looked at him as like a quack. Like, dude, you're a hoax. He sold his own medicine, such as Tumblety's Pimple Destroyer, which is just kind of funny to think about that people back then even were like, fuck pimples. Like, he really reminds me of those like traveling salesmen sell like hair growth and stuff like that in almost like any like time period movie. Do you know what I mean? Like that's totally what he reminds me of. He was also a very like flamboyant, eccentric man. He liked to wear very fancy clothes. A lot of the time it was very military based. Like he liked to look good, and he also just had like a big personality. So there were rumors that he was connected to one of the deaths of his patients in Boston, but for that he did avoid prosecution. I think we can agree he definitely wasn't a, you know, goodness out of his heart sort of healer. He was actually arrested in New Orleans for pickpocketing. So he's definitely just not a saint in general. Like he definitely may claim to be this profound physician, but it's definitely for the money and not for the I want to help people. I know what you're thinking. You're like, Jack the Ripper was in London. Like, what the hell does this guy have to do with that? Well, Francis Tumblety actually traveled to Europe quite a bit. He went to London a lot. He went to France a lot. He was a world-renowned traveler. He just liked it. Again, eccentric, he likes to be in the know. He was also the type of person to name drop a lot. Like he would tell people that he healed Abraham Lincoln and Louis Napoleon, and you know, he really liked to come off as being like a big cheese or like a big deal. He really just seemed to like blow smoke up his own ass because he really wasn't, like no one else was saying that about him, he was saying it about himself. So apparently Francis was suspected of being Jack the Ripper because he was extremely misogynist. Like he had issues towards women, and also he had a previous track record of crime, and so the police were just looking into him because he had just suspicious behavior. Some people dismiss Tumblety as being a suspect because, like in some reports, he had a very big mustache, and so it would have been a very noticeable characteristic. He was also a lot taller than most people reported Jack the Ripper being, but then other reports say that like no, his mustache was actually quite normal, so he could have probably fit it. Again, the facts aren't really facts. Now we're going to talk about the second suspect, which is the Maniac known as Aaron Kominski. So Aaron Kominski was actually a hairdresser in the Whitechapel district. So in the actual police report of listed suspects that they have, they only put the last name Kominski, and that was actually quite a common name in the Whitechapel district. So like we've sort of linked Aaron Kominski to this. Anyways, it said that he worked on and off at his job, which is pretty common for most people in the Whitechapel district. No one there really had like steady income. No one there was living the dream. And unfortunately, during this time, his mental health started to seriously decline. So in 1890, after all of the murders had occurred, Aaron was actually placed in a mental asylum because he threatened his sister with a knife because she was helping him out at the time. I believe they were living together, and he just kind of spazzed out and pulled a knife on her. Apparently, Aaron Kominski was a main suspect for Jack the Ripper because he again also had very strong hatred towards women, and they said that he had homicidal tendencies. Now I'm not sure if that means like because he pulled a knife out on his sister or if he was doing other things. I couldn't really find that out, but homicidal tendencies is just like an odd thing to say. Like didn't she either kill someone or didn't, or do you just think about killing people? Like, I would like more explanation. He also lived obviously in the Whitechapel district at the time. That's where he worked, that's where he lived, so again, but that's actually not the most juiciest thing about Aaron Kominski. So apparently in 2014, an author named Russell Edwards bought a shawl at an auction. Now he bought this shawl believing it belonged to Catherine Eddowes, one of the Jack the Ripper victims, and he was under the impression that it was the shawl she wore when she was attacked. Russell actually wrote a book about this endeavor called Naming Jack the Ripper. Anyways, he requested this shawl go under DNA analysis by Dr. Jari Luhalainen. Yeah, listen. Dr. Jari, that's just what we're going with. Now, I'm not gonna go too much into this because I don't want it to be too technical, but basically, I'm just gonna straight up read from my notes here. What they did for the DNA analysis is they compared the DNA on the shawl to the descendants of Catherine Eddowes and the descendants of Aaron Kominski. Jari stated that the DNA strand found was a specific type that was super rare. Jari stated that the DNA strand found was a specific type that was super rare, which means the likelihood of it being Aaron Kominski was very high. So the likelihood of Jack the Ripper being Aaron Kominski, very high. However, there's a common DNA strand that is similar to this. So the rare strand is called 314.1C, but the common strand is 315.1C, which is a strand that 99% of people of European descent share. So a lot of people think that he just like, whoop, messed up when he was doing the DNA analysis. People especially think this because he has never published his findings in like a research paper, like a scientific research paper that could be peer-reviewed by other scientists, which if you found something so big like this and really stood by your results, you would 100% do that. Like the fact that you didn't is a dead giveaway that like, okay buddy. But for a while, especially when this book came out, people did believe that Jack the Ripper was officially named, identity found, we know who did it. Isn't that crazy? Like I don't remember anything like this. I don't remember there being like an actual, you know, news report about Jack the Ripper being found. I don't remember any of that. Do you guys remember it? Did you see anything about that? I didn't. How awful would that be though, like going down in history as like the scientist that like fucked up. So now we're moving on to the third suspect we're going to talk about, which is one of the most likely suspects in the Jack the Ripper murders. So this one I've dubbed the Vengeful Lover, and his name is Joseph Barnett. So Joseph was a fish porter in the Whitechapel district who actually lived with the last victim, Mary Kelly. And it is said that throughout his life, he had lived in multiple sections of Whitechapel, so he would know the area quite well, giving him good getaway spots and places he could hide or get into if he had friends in the area. So apparently he was in love with Mary Kelly, or at least that's the suspicion that people have, because in an interview on November 10th, he said that Mary Kelly was his wife when in fact they were only roommates, like they were never officially married. So Barnett disagreed with Mary's lifestyle of being a prostitute, and while Joseph was a fish porter, Mary wasn't being a prostitute, but then Joseph lost his job, so she went back to prostitution. Basically, the main theory is that Joseph killed prostitutes to help keep Mary off the streets. Like, even though he didn't have a job and they were really struggling for income, he didn't want her making her money that way. Not surprisingly, their money troubles caused a lot of fighting between the two, and Mary Kelly apparently did have a bit of a drinking problem when it came to gin. Joseph Barnett also didn't really like this. One night, Mary Kelly brought home 2 prostitutes with her, and it kind of sounds like they were just her friends that she like brought home. I was like, hey, let's hang out, let's have a drink, let's relax. And Joseph like lost his shit. Like, to him, this was just something that was so offensive and so disgusting that like he couldn't forgive her for it. Apparently they had this huge fight and ended up like breaking a window, and it just turned into this whole thing. Joseph grabbed all his shit and moved out and was like, see you later, I can't forgive you for this, this is just too much. After Joseph Barnett moved out, only 10 days later, Mary Kelly ends up dead in her apartment, which is suspicious, especially since hers was the last murder and it was so gruesome. A lot of people kind of think it was maybe a crime of passion. After Mary's murder, Barnett was questioned for 4 hours, and especially since he lived with Mary Kelly, he knew her schedule, he knew the layout of the apartment. She was the last victim. If it was a crime of passion, people think that, the first murders was to get Kelly off the streets, and then when they had this huge blowout, he ended up killing her because he was just so rage-filled and heartbroken. Some people think that because Barnett was a fish porter that that's why he would have anatomical knowledge, but I think that that's like a bit of a reach. Newspapers also stated that friends of Joseph's called him Jack, which is like, this is where I think the kind of theory on this guy falls apart. People say, oh, like after he killed Mary Kelly, there was no more reason to kill anymore, so that's why, he just kind of stopped doing it. And like, because of how gruesome and horrific these murders are, I don't think you could just stop doing that. Like, if it was something you were okay with doing, and especially since they happen so often, so right after each other, like boom, 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 I don't think you'd be able to just like cold turkey it and walk away forever. Like, that seems just, I don't know if that's the strongest argument for this person of suspect, I don't know. I do think though that the idea of Joseph killing because of prostitution, like killing prostitutes to kind of get Mary away from that lifestyle, could make sense, especially if he had, a mom or a sister that did it while he was growing up and he really didn't like that or just had like hatred towards it. I could see that theory kind of panning out. Personally though, I think if he killed Mary Kelly, after a while he would fall in love with someone else, and his anger, I think, would end up turning out in a different way. Even if it wasn't like prostitution that like ended up triggering him, something else I feel like would have spurred another set of gruesome murders that he would try to justify in his head, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think he would just cold turkey like, no, I'm done. So I do have a couple of bonus suspects that I thought were worth a mention. I'm just not gonna go too much into them. The most ripperologists, yes, that's a thing. It's the people who specifically study the Jack the Ripper cases. So James Maybrick is one of the main suspects because supposedly a diary was found under his floorboards, which basically has him stating that he's Jack the Ripper. But again, when you look more into it, the history of where this diary came from, if it's actually from him, and the lineage and how it was found, is a bit muddy. However, there was also a pocket watch found, again with like, it had James Maybrick initials and then some other scripture on it that like linked it to Jack the Ripper. But again, it's not a clear line of like, yes, that came from James, and yes, this was his and it wasn't forged. It looked like it was made, back in the old days, but again, not clear enough evidence to definitively say like, yes, he is Jack the Ripper. So the second bonus suspect that actually intrigues me the most when I heard about it is that Jack the Ripper is actually a woman. Now, people call her Jill the Ripper, but I think it could still be called Jack. Like, like if your name was Jacqueline or Jackie, like I still think that works. I don't think Jill the Ripper really works personally, but people think it might have been a woman because this entire time the police would have been looking for a male suspect. So if Jack the Ripper was a woman, she could easily just walk the streets while like right after killing someone and it wouldn't have been even questioned at the time. Even if she had blood on her at this time, a lot of women were what's the word, like a housewife, delivering babies. Anyways, they delivered babies a lot of this time, so it actually wasn't uncommon for women to be walking around with like blood on them or their clothes, especially in the Whitechapel district, because there was a lot of that. Again, it's more of a conspiracy theory. There is no real evidence showing that it was a woman. Definitely let me know what you guys think down below. Do you think it was the medicine man, Francis Tumblety? Do you think it was the Maniac, Aaron Kominski? Do you think it was the vengeful lover, Joseph Barnett, or one of the other suspects that we talked about? Let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to vote on what topic you'd like me to do next. I'll have the poll linked in the eye. And this is your reminder to check out 401 Files here on YouTube. Again, I'll have it linked in the description box. Definitely go check them out. Thank you guys for sticking through all of this. Definitely subscribe if you haven't already. We do a lot of these spooky get ready with me videos. Follow me on Instagram if you want more witchy content. Check me out on Facebook if you want more Halloween memes. I'll have them all linked below. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in my next video.